It's time to take command with former NFL tight end Logan Paulsen and former Commanders beat reporter Craig Hoffman.
Take Command podcast from Odyssey Sports, live from La Casa de Paulsen. I'm Craig Hoffman. That is Logan Paulsen. I've driven over here in Ashburn after Josh Harris's presser, after open locker room this morning, and Logan, there's plenty to talk about for sure, as today is Black Monday, the day that Ron Rivera ultimately saw his tenure come to an end with the Commanders. So we will talk about that kind of Rivera post-mortem. We will talk about some of the early names that have come out and kind of what's next for this Commanders franchise. But Logan, you got a chance to obviously get to know Ron over the last couple of years. You did the show with him weekly. You got a chance to talk to him on and off camera. When you think back to the 4 years, there's a lot of stuff that we'll get into in kind of the negative stuff that ultimately ends with him losing his job and being 4-13 this year. We're not going to hide from that. Yeah. But when something comes to an end, you tend to reflect on the positive first. So what are your reflections of these last 4 years?
Yeah, I mean, I think he was a guy that came in and kind of had like a kind of an unwinnable task, so to speak. Like the culture here in Washington is always, at least recently, has been kind of terrible, and I think that started with the top, started with the old ownership. And, he kind of was tasked as the guy to kind of get everything back on track. And I think, to a large extent, he was able to do that, at least from a team standpoint, kind of bringing in the right kind of character guys and alleviating some of the adversity in the locker room that you'd seen over the past couple of years, which is great. But in terms of getting a kind of a fair shot to be a head coach, I don't think it was very fair. But, nothing in life, nothing in the NFL is very fair, right? Ton of adversity over the course of his tenure. And that's the thing that I always think back to, obviously the cancer. And I don't think people realized quite how sick he was, and then there's the COVID year after the cancer. Then there's all the stuff with the scandals and the sexual harassment stuff associated with the ownership. So there was never like a clean sheet for him. But that's life in the NFL. You got to kind of like roll with those punches. And then there's obviously the stuff, from a football standpoint that we've been kind of subtly critical of over the past couple of weeks. But I think that's what I say. And I say ultimately Ron is a good person, a smarter football guy than I think a lot of people want to give him credit for. Yeah. And I think those two things are nice, are nice things to say about him. Smart dude, good guy, really, really good dude. And, but ultimately, like you don't win games with that all the time.
For sure. I think it was interesting being in the locker room today, and you ask all the players in some form or fashion, what do you think of Ron as he's headed out the door? And there's not really a bad word to be said. The closest to that was Charles Leno was basically like, this is the business. Yeah. And it was pretty clear that Leno didn't think a lot of Ron as a football coach, but he went out of his way to say like, he's a good man. Right. And so I think you see that through and through, and there is something to that. And in talking to some folks around the building today, you even hear like, man, it was really bad at times. Right. And, someone made the analogy of just like, he was the guy that took the charge. Like, just plant your feet in there, and LeBron James is coming down the lane, and
that's a good.
You're going to take it in the face, and Ron was willing to take it. Yeah. And which is something that I think is an interesting thing to think about, like an intellectual exercise of like, he did sign up for that to an extent. When you go to work for Daniel Snyder, you're going to have to take some charges, but I don't think anyone could have anticipated that. And obviously, also, I think you bring up something that kind of we all brush over now in 2024, like. He takes the job in January of 2020. We do not know that a global pandemic is going to shut down the world a month later or 2 months later. And so what happens is he's trying to instill this new culture and make some of these changes, and he can't meet with guys. Right. And the draft process is very different that year. Like, who knows? Do they sit down with Chase Young face to face and be like, I don't know. Right. Like, you just don't know. But then again, every other team had to draft the same way in 2020. And that is that reality.
But I also think couple that with the fact that he was sick.
You're right. Like, and then after, sure.
It became like the rules around the building a lot. A lot of people were really concerned about him coming off, being kind of immune compromised, all that kind of stuff. So I think it was just kind of stacking making a terrible situation that much worse. Yeah. And I think it was very, very challenging. I mean, that's all we can say about it. It was very, very hard. There was a lot of adversity associated with it. And did other teams find ways to handle that? Absolutely. But I do think the fact that he was sick, is something that people forget about. And for the fact that he was able to put on a good face for a lot of that year and not let it affect the team. Crazy to say, but not let it really affect the team.
And to the extent that it did, like, it was a positive because guys really did rally around him. Yeah. That was a real thing. It feels, weird now looking back on it, but like in the moment, that was definitely a thing. That was a thing. in terms of where it goes wrong, I think, you make decisions as a football person, as a manager, as in his case, as a president of football operations. And this is where I think it's very easy to be critical of him because it's correct criticism. Not like, oh yeah, we're having fun criticizing, but like it's very easy. Eventually, through all that stuff, you have to make decisions. And if you make right ones, despite all the circumstances, you can overcome it. You can win football games. You can build something. And it just seemed like, to me, the thing that is overwhelming throughout his era is the not getting correct the biggest decisions. And so what I mean by that is when you spend big money on a free agent or you have a first round draft pick, and like a player personnel standpoint, and I think also as coordinators, I think there's mistakes made with all three of them that he ultimately has in some form or fashion, whether it's keeping them too long, hiring a bad one, a bad fit, whatever, we can get into it. But I think from a player personnel standpoint, the biggest signings he had, William Jackson, big money free agent, total whiff. For first round draft picks. Like Jamin Davis is a fine player. I don't know that it was a good use of a first round pick. Chase, obviously, and especially in that year when you have the number 2 overall pick, you could take Tua, you could take Justin Herbert, and instead you take Chase Young, and it doesn't work out. I think that to me is like, if you get some of those right, some of the other things are less important because you have so much talent that you make it work. And I think that is the biggest undoing on a long list of things that did not go well. And I think some of the other things tend to fill in the gaps and illuminate maybe some of the reasons why, but as the headline, to me, that's the headline.
Yeah, and I think John Keim said something really interesting on the podcast, and I think this speaks to what Ron is as a person. He's very optimistic, and I think that leads to one of the things that why guys like him. He's very optimistic. He's got pretty good energy when he's around the guys, which is always fun to see, but it leads to maybe Sam Mills stays a little bit longer than he should. Maybe Scott Turner stays a little bit longer than he should. And instead of
Jack as well,
nipping those things in the butt when it looked like it wasn't going to work out, you're kind of giving the guy the benefit of the doubt, the benefit of the opportunity. And I respect Ron for that, but I also think there's times where you got to say, hey, like this isn't going the way I thought it was going to go. Like specifically the Sam Mills thing, because I think you can kind of see the cancerous effect that had on that group for the rest of his time here, right? Chase didn't develop the way he thought. Montez didn't develop the way he thought. Obviously, John and Payne were very successful, but that was after Sam left, right? So you bring in a guy and Z who's played a lot of football, and again, you see the benefit for them, but not necessarily the rest of the group. What is Chase Young if you've got kind of that stud defensive line coach that I think Ron thought he had? When you talked to Ron about it, he was like, he was the disciple of the best D-line coach that I've ever worked with, and so I thought he was going to be the next guy, and it didn't shake out. And I think identifying that early and saying, okay, this isn't going the way I thought it was going to go, is a really tough thing. But I also think his optimism paid off in certain situations. Like he saw the development of Cam Curl. I think he saw the development of Jamin Davis a little bit, right? And it took a long time to get there, but I think there's good and bad with being an overly optimistic person. No
doubt. I think with Jamin is a great example too of kind of the optimism without a plan.
Sure.
I guess. And that to me is like the other big identifying characteristic of Rivera's tenure is that there was never a cohesive plan for how to build. And I'm not talking about organizationally. I'm talking about football team, like the roster.
It definitely, I know what you're saying. It definitely appears that way from like 1,000
from the personnel. Like how does the personnel and the scheme go together, and does it stay year over year over year over year so that you can literally build on it? And they went from Scott Turner or Eric Coryell vertical passing game to like, this ain't working, we got to run the football more. And then you draft Brian Robinson and you build an O-line that's probably shaded a little better as run blockers than pass protectors. Defensively, like, are you a blitz heavy team, or are you kind of built around this D-line? You're going to play a bunch of coverage. And is that coverage zone or man? Then you get corners that are the opposite of what you're planning on doing. And like schematically, personnel, cohesiveness, there wasn't any over his 4 years where you go, that's what they were trying to build. And I think that informs some of those decisions in terms of like sticking with guys a little bit too long, but also kind of wraps back to the first where I started, where like, okay, if we're going to be a zone team and we bring in William Jackson III, like it probably is not going to work great.
Yeah, and I think it's also, again, they go back to the optimism that we have the right coaches in place to get William Jackson III in the right spot, or we have the right coaches to make sure that we can play
turn Jamin Davis into someone who's worth taking at 19.
And I think that's right. And I think, we were this year you were like, oh, here it is. But I think, it took him 3 years to get to this point. And again, like Jamin went through a lot of adversity and, but I think that was one of the criticisms of the pick at the time from, the national kind of draft people, was that he was so green. Like, what was he going to be? So I think it kind of goes back to that optimism and making those hard choices. And I think, John said this, and I think John has great insight on this, is he kind of favored the familiarity as opposed to, and there are, like, look around the league. Like, there's a reason that Kyle Shanahan worked with Mike McDaniels for 10 years, right? Like, there's a familiarity there and a trust, and that is a good working relationship. But also you need to kind of go out and make some tough decisions when it comes to staffing and kind of find the best people as opposed to the people that you're most familiar with, I guess.
It's also one thing, like when you're Kyle and you've been as successful as Kyle is, it's like you're getting hired because you were super successful and you want to bring the people that helped you do that. Mm-hmm. Ron, rebuilt, as I put in one story, I think it was Sam in the Post, it's like kind of rebuilt Carolina 2.0. And they weren't exactly like, of course, 2015 was a magical season. They make the Super Bowl, they're 15-1, Cam wins MVP. But outside of that, there's not a lot of success in Carolina. No. So like, why are you rebuilding that here? And it goes to that optimism because you think you can make it work. You've got some good plans on paper. And it's just like, same thing with Eric, right? Eric, probably the best OC on the market last offseason. I'm not mad. I can't go back and pretend like I was mad at the hire, but it didn't fit with the plan and the personnel when you talk about young quarterback, the way the O-line was built, all those types of things, to then implement a game plan stylistically, run pass, kind of how leveraged the quarterback was with what they had. But it was like, oh, let's just get talented people and make sure, and maybe it'll work out. But I don't know, favoring certain talents over others, favoring not making sure that there was, again, that cohesive vision that fit into. And that's where I think that ultimately this era falls short.
Yeah, I don't disagree with that. I think that's kind of right on the nose, and it's tough. And it's so easy. I just want to say this too. It's so easy to look back on these decisions and say, oh, like it's because of X, Y, Z, because you have the benefit of hindsight. But I do think there was a lot of people who were kind of, questioning Sam Mills when he was here,
For sure.
And I think obviously Ron was too. It's just about how long it took the decision to be made. And I think he ultimately saw it. I think he saw those decisions and made the decisions. It's just about, the timing of them, I think, in addition to some other things.
No doubt. All right. Anything else, reflection on Rivera before we do what everyone wants, which is to look ahead?
Right. So I guess I would just say, like, thank Ron for his time. Really appreciate it. I know it didn't go exactly the way he wanted it or the way the fans wanted it, but gave a lot of time to this organization, and that can't be overlooked. So
yeah, I think that, I was talking with someone today and they were like, you know what? Part of the reason that we could trust the end of, like, make it all the way to the end of the season was because he was going to land the plane. Yeah. Like, he is a professional, right. And that's not something that you can count on every coach in the NFL doing. But it's certainly something that Ron was good for. And now the plane has landed and forward.
I just want to say this, like, talking about being a pro, I got to do that show with him every week. And I think Ron could see the writing on the wall probably week 7, week 8. And he did not deviate or change his personality at all when it came to doing the shows and media access. And takes a special kind of courage to do that. As you've dealt with guys who have been on the chopping block or
not psyched about it,
not pumped, and they take it on other people, and never saw that from him. So again, pro's pro, did a great job, landed the plane like you said, but I think it's definitively time to move on to the next phase.
Yeah, without a doubt. So let's look ahead at what's next. Onward we go. Take Command podcast from Odyssey Sports. I'm Greg Hoffman. He is Logan Paulson. So Josh Harris spoke today. I was there for the press conference as we're recording this, so about an hour ago. He described what he hopes will be a thorough but rapid process to hire the lead football executive and ultimately head coach. I thought it was interesting. He said that, he doesn't have, like, he has a structure in mind. He would like to hire some kind of chief football executive, whether that's a GM or they have another title, and let that person help hire the head coach. But it definitely sounded like if they either fall in love with the head coach and that person has options and they have to make a call without the GM being hired, they will. I'm just going to refer to this football person as a GM from now on to make that clear. Then they will. It also sounded like if it's going to take giving that person some kind of personnel control, that they would potentially do it. Basically, he's like, we will be flexible with the talent. I want the best talent here. Now, I don't know that they're going to do that. And I do think that they'll probably be very diligent about that. They don't want to give someone too much power, a la what's kind of been the downfall of Belichick in New England. And frankly, was a problem with Ron here, too much on his plate. And Josh did describe how he feels like head coach is an 80-hour-a-week job and lead football executive GM is an 80-hour-a-week job. And there's definitely two jobs there. So
that's, I mean, I think that's good insight though, honestly. But it's funny you mentioned that. I was just looking at this list you sent me, and there's one guy on the list that you're like, he would want personnel control, and that's Harbaugh, right?
Yeah.
Like, and so if that's what they got to do to get him here, I'm sure they would be like, oh yeah, we'll make something happen.
Which would be interesting, because Jim, of the guys that are there, I think they're all good. So as we're recording this, it's 2:20 on Monday. And the list so far of people that they have said they're going to reach out to and request interviews for are Ben Johnson and Aaron Glenn of the Lions, Anthony Weaver of the Ravens, Raheem Morris, of course, used to coach here in DC, but currently the defensive coordinator for the Rams. And then apparently they have reached out to Jim Harbaugh's agent, Don Yee, who represented Tom Brady, amongst others, for a long time. But Harbaugh has been very clear that he's not listening to anything from the NFL until tonight, when the national championship game with his Michigan Wolverines ends. So he's a guy that is obviously a phenomenal coach.
Does he get you excited? I know
he's great. He's one that's so interesting to me because I have no doubt if Jim Harbaugh was here, they'd win. I also have no doubt he'd be gone in 5 years because he irritates the hell out of people.
That's what he does. I mean, but like you create a winning culture, and his resume is fantastic.
It's unbelievable.
Like when you look at it, and obviously my father-in-law is a big Stanford guy, big San Francisco 49ers guy. So watching what he was able to do to both those organizations, what he did at the D2 level at San Diego, not San Diego State. University of San Diego.
Oh yeah, that's what it was.
And then to go to Michigan, which everyone thought would never outshine Ohio State and out-recruit and out-coach and out-tough those teams. I mean, definitely they would win football games.
100%.
But he does have a reputation for being...
he's got a shelf life.
Yes, that's exactly right.
But then again, I don't know how much you worry about that because most coaches don't really last that long in the league unless you're like Belichick or Mike Tomlin, who's just, finished year 17. Most coaches, like if you can get into a second contract, you've done an unbelievable job. And so I don't know how much I'd worry about that because I'd be just as worried that I'm not even going to put a name on that list, but that Coach X is also not going to have a shelf life longer than 5 years because they're not going to win enough.
Right.
So it is there is that. But I think what was good about what Josh had to say today is he clearly understands the cohesive thing. Right. That thing that we talked about in the first segment that Ron never really got here of like, I want my front office and my coaching staff to be on the same page and have a vision for like what this team looks like. And it's funny. I don't know if that's the right word. It's ironic that Ron didn't have that because Ron was both the coach and the front office. Yeah. But it didn't happen. So
but I think that also speaks to how weird that first year was for Ron, where he's like, in part, he's sick and he's kind of making all these decisions. And then eventually it kind of settled in when the Martys got there. Right. But it took a minute. Right. And I think like he did understand it. But again, it kind of goes back to that.
But it also shows the skill sets, right? Like
100%.
Can you 100%. You think you know what you want as a coach, but can you find it as a talent evaluator?
Right.
And
like, do you have the time? I love that analogy. Like they're both 80-hour-a-week jobs. Like you need to find two people that are very smart. And I think, sorry to cut you off, but like you look at San Fran, for example, I think they do a great job of there is a personnel department, there is a head coach, but they work very closely together on establishing their cultural identity.
100%. And it's fine for your coach to establish a lot of that identity as long as he really is someone who's going to be there for a long time. But then ultimately, do you have the people to execute it? Because everyone always wants to make it into like what happens in the draft room, who has the final say, and like there's going to be some warring of the words with two sides standing on tables throwing helmets at each other, and it's like you've done that work beforehand because you work together. Though speaking of the front office side, as of again when we're recording this, they've already put in requests for Adam Peters of the 49ers, Chiefs assistant general manager Mike Borgonzi, Eagles assistant GM Alec Howell, Ellaby, who's a big analytics guy. Obviously, I would assume that Harris is somewhat familiar with how the Eagles are run from his time running the Sixers before Jeffrey Lurie might have known that was a future spy. And then you got Ian Cunningham from the Bears and Glenn Cook from the Browns, both of whom are very, very highly thought of assistant general managers. But I just think that the general, like, I got this, I know what I'm doing nature of Josh Harris is really impressive. Yeah. And, you know, we've seen a lot of different owners across sports, and how many different owners do we see, especially NFL owners, that like they speak and you're like, that guy's lucky he's rich. And like Josh Harris, you hear him speak and you're like, I know how that dude got rich.
Yeah, right. Yeah,
he's really smart.
Yeah, I think that is really interesting. It's nice to see that here. It's nice to, and again, it's always, you know, juxtaposing it to the person that was here before, like just someone who's can be very outward facing and articulate themselves and is comfortable in front of the camera and has some kind of engagement while also remaining kind of professional. And we've seen it not go well in other organizations. Like I look at Carolina right now, and that's a tough deal. So, but I think it seems like he's got the process sound out. And also, I was just looking at these candidates again while you were talking, and it seems like they've identified guys that have strong kind of cultures of toughness. Like you look at the Detroit Lions, look at the Baltimore Ravens, look at Jim Harbaugh, like that's his thing, right? And even Raheem Morris to a certain extent, like when you watch what they're doing in LA, like that's an established culture of winning, right? You know, since Sean McVay's been there. So I do think it's a very kind of unique and very specific, in a general way, very specific type of guy that they're looking for.
Right. And I think everyone always gets focused on, I don't say everyone gets focused on the wrong things. Sometimes people get focused on the wrong things. Offensive, defensive, this, that. Right. Oh, we want a guy that's coached both sides of the ball. I love a tight ends coach. I love a tight ends coach because they understand the run game and the pass game. And like all those things are pertinent information, but like the overarching theme, the overarching thread that ties them together is that toughness element. Yeah. Mm-hmm. And do you have that from a culture standpoint? Speaking of culture, I do want to get back to the name specifically in a second, but I think to start a little broader, they hired Bob Myers, which it's so to be clear, based off what Harris said today, both Myers, the former Golden State Warriors chief executive who helped build this dynasty, obviously Steph Curry is the most important piece of that. If you can get a Steph Curry as a basketball player, you're going to win a lot of basketball games.
All the pieces that you're going to find there, right?
Sure. But like Curry and
like
some of the luck they had in terms of their personnel, contract that they were able to sign him to, which allowed them to do other things. Yeah. All that's great. Like I would tell you as someone who is a massive NBA fan, who is a big fan of the Warriors because I just love the way they play and has been following this thing for a long time. Steph Curry is the most important to the person of the Warriors dynasty. Duh. I can make an argument Bob Myers is the second. Like from the other moves he made to how he built the organization to him being a person that from a culture standpoint was an enforcer of the culture, but also kind of a therapist of the culture. Right. Like Draymond Green and Bob Myers, and Draymond Green obviously is a very tough, interesting personality, right? Someone who I'm a huge fan of, but like Draymond's got his issues, and he's been working through them, specifically in the last 2 months. Myers was someone who really was able to work with Draymond on a lot of stuff, and kind of kept the boiling or the water at the right temperature to be hot enough that they would win, but not boil over. Like he was an active a part of that, as was Steve Kerr, obviously the head coach. So when you talk about hiring someone to help build a culture, and even if he's not going to be involved much past this search, he is, I think, a tremendously interesting person, and I would say a smart person. And what Harris said today is he is probably going to continue to advise Harris past this search. It won't be anything formal. He's not going to be the team president, nothing like that. It sounds like anyway, but he will be an advisor. Then the other guy they hire is Chris Spielman, longtime executive in the league, 10 years with the Vikings, is one executive of the year, and that joins Mitchell Rales, obviously Josh Harris, and Magic Johnson as the predominant people who will be conducting the search.
Yeah, I think that's exciting for me. You know, and I think like, you know, when you're talking about, oh, this is a football organization, what does he know about it? But I think you mentioned like the cultural element, right? Understanding the pieces, the leadership, and kind of that je ne sais quoi that we talk about in relation to quarterback all the time, but like, how are you as a leader of men? And I remember, in Sean McVay's, interview process with the Rams, like they interviewed Marshall Faulk, not because Marshall Faulk has this great football insight, because they felt like Marshall Faulk's a good leader and he could identify someone that could get the guys to rally behind him. And it sounds like this guy from the Golden State Warriors is that guy. And then you couple that with the GM background or the executive background of the guy from Minnesota. I forget his name at the moment. Chris Spielman. Like, I think that's a very, very potent mix of things. A guy that is super dialed in on the football side, a guy that has made a winner at the highest level, right, in the basketball world. And I think both those things coming together work in a really, really nice fashion. And then add in, the ownership group as it exists and Magic Johnson, all that stuff. It makes me excited that a good decision can be made here with a lot of clarity.
Yeah. I mean, to me, if you can sit down in a room and you can impress Bob Myers, who has won 4 NBA championships. And by the way, before that, championship player at UCLA as a player. And then he was an agent for a long time. So he has worked on all sides of the sports business. He knows a lot of people as well. So when you talk about doing some of that research that kind of happens in the background, Bob Myers is very qualified to do it. You can sit down and impress him. Magic Johnson, one of the greatest winners in the history of pro sports. Josh Harris, who absolutely built a behemoth in the finance industry. Sure. Mitch Rales, who's built multi-million-dollar companies. And who am I forgetting? Oh, and Chris Spielman, who was a longtime NFL player and a great executive for a long time. If you can impress those people, you're probably qualified for the job. And then my one concern, right? Concern's too strong. The one thing that I'm interested in making sure that they overcome is it's not a lot of football experience. And so when you talk about someone who has that football vision, obviously there's a lot on Spielman's plate there, but I think that thing is more important for the head coach than it is the GM.
I was going to say, what I would hope is that they hire a VP of football ops, a GM, whatever that person is first. And again, not that they're
and that's their plan, just to be clear.
Not that they're going to be, that guy's going to be making the coaching hire, but at least you have a sounding board from a more football centric perspective that kind of gives you, hey, like I can work with this guy. He's got a good reputation. He or she has a good reputation. And I think that's ultimately like kind of what you said they're planning on doing. And I think that feels like the right decision because a GM, while important for football ops, very critical in terms of vision, is a different type of vision than what you're going to see from your football coach. And I think that group seems to be at the moment very, very qualified to identify that kind of talent and then using that as a resource, identify the head coach.
Right. Because your GM needs to be able to hire scouts that kind of get at that granular level. And of course, if you have a GM with a scouting background, that person's scouting ability becomes very important. But
right.
That's,
because really like it's about finding someone who, again, has this vision you're describing, right, for the organization, and then can distill copious amounts of information, right? That's really what it ultimately comes down to. And it's the vision, the copious amounts of information, then how are they to work with, right? In terms of compromising and dealing with other people. So it's nothing I think overly complicated. It's just about making sure you identify the right person for this position and the vision of the ownership group and what they think for the franchise.
And so then you have two football people in the room to talk ball with the head coach candidates. And so what that'll look like from a timing standpoint is there are virtual interviews that can happen up until basically January 22nd. They happen in smaller windows. And it's different for people that currently have jobs with clubs that are in the playoffs versus don't. And it's very convoluted. I read the rules and was like, I still don't fully understand this. Which might have something to do with my reading comprehension at 10 o'clock last night at FedEx Field or whatever the hell time it was. I don't think it was that late. Anyway, point is, they'll do that. And so they'll cast a very wide net because if you don't do that first round of virtual interviews, then you can't get someone for an in-person and ultimately hire them down the road. So they'll cast a very wide net, get a bunch of virtual interviews done, hopefully within these next couple of weeks, hire that football person, and then conduct the final round of in-person interviews, hire a head coach. And I think the phrase that Harris used was great because I always worry about the timing of these things too. Of like, if you want to hit the ground running your first season, you can't, if you're stuck waiting because your coach wins the Super Bowl, okay.
Right.
But you would ideally like to hire your head coach before the Senior Bowl.
Yeah, I mean that's usually how it plays out, right? Like there was a couple of years where like D'Amico Ryans is left out of the coaching cycle because they're pushing deep into the playoffs, or Eric Bieniemy, that was an issue for him for a couple of years in a row, right? So that is a thing that's definitely important in terms of this calculus moving forward.
Yeah, so obviously you definitely want to have that lead football person in by the Senior Bowl so they can go down, be there, present, running your scouting department, get it as organized as you can within a week because they probably only have that long, maybe two, to get hired. So that's definitely definitely something interesting to watch from a timing perspective. But hey, if like Ben Johnson and Aaron Glenn are your two final candidates and the Lions make the Super Bowl, then you're going to have to wait to hire a head coach. And that's just the reality of it. Steichen and Gannon dealt with that last year. And for whatever it's worth, like Steichen and the Colts had a pretty good year. So you can certainly
honestly,
overcome it.
So did Gannon. I know that was the worst roster in football. And like he was able to kind of cultivate a winning mentality there. Scrappy, let's say. Yeah. Which is good in the first year. You want to see that. So
for sure. All right. So let's wrap up with this then. Last few minutes here. The names themselves. Yeah. I don't know how much tape you've watched of these teams. Obviously, throughout the course of the season, you're naturally going to get some of them because they're Commanders' opponents, or as you're scouting the Commanders' opponents, you see them. Ben Johnson is the belle of the ball. I saw that shout out to Ben Standing. I think he used that phrase, and I don't want to rip it off from him and not credit him because that's a terrible thing to do. So he is the guy that is going to be the top candidate overall. What do you make of him, his background? Got some tight ends coaching, got some quarterbacks coaching, played quarterback. And obviously the last 2 years, the Lions have been one of the best offenses in football.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's just one of those offenses that you really enjoy watching. You know, like in the same way that you turn on Miami, you turn on San Francisco, Houston, and you're just like, wow, they are doing a lot of great stuff here from a protection standpoint, from a run game standpoint. I love the physical mentality that they bring each and every week, much like San Francisco, and then the deep play explosive ability that they generate in the offense and how they deleverage the quarterback spot. And I just think like that's good. That is... To me, you're going to be hard-pressed to find a more innovative offensive football mind outside of those three teams, and it's great that he's going to be a guy that's going to be open for a coaching position. Another thing I like about him is he's worked with Dan Campbell. And say what you want about Dan Campbell from a football X's and O's standpoint, talk about a culture builder. Like he got to see that from square one, taking a loser and turning it into a winner. And so I like that there's that background exposure for him, in addition to all the X's and O's stuff that you see.
Yeah, I think I've mentioned this on the pod before, but we had Adam Amin, Fox broadcaster, on a couple of weeks ago, about a month ago. And I asked him, you know, because, hey, you get all these production meetings, you meet with a ton of coordinators around the league. Is there anybody that stands out as a potential head coach? And Adam hasn't had some of the teams with the names on the list, but he'd had the Lions a couple of times. He's like, dude, Ben Johnson is on a different world. He's got that it factor, that dynamic personality that will translate well to being a head coach. Another guy that is definitely a dynamic personality, if you watch Hard Knocks, the Lions edition last year, there was a fair amount of Aaron Glenn. He's an interesting guy to me because he was on the hot seat earlier this year, and they've kind of figured it out enough down in Detroit. And he's a guy that, former player, really good player, by the way, in his days with the Jets. But is he, like, for a guy that was this recently on the hot seat, does that get you as excited, or does it almost get you more excited because he's such, like, he did some of the problem solving that you look for?
And again, like, you're looking for guys that solve problems defensively. I think he falls in that bucket. He's very aggressive, likes to bring a lot of zero pressure. Think, you know, kind of Wink Martindale-ish, you know what I'm saying? We're scheming up protections, we're attacking teams. I think the thing that comes off this list more than anything is they come from tough cultures, right? Yeah. And you're going to be hard pressed to find a defensive coach and an offensive coach from a tougher culture than the Detroit Lions, who are both kind of up and coming, optimistic in terms of what they bring from a football standpoint, right? So I think like that's one reason. I don't think it's happenstance that the guy from Baltimore is on there. Yeah. I don't think it's happenstance.
Different guy than a lot of people were expecting from Baltimore, though.
Right. I agree. Yeah.
But we'll see. You know, this is a list as of the coaching vacancy that's 4 hours old.
Right.
So.
But I think the thing that jumps out to me is it's not necessarily the X's and O's, because if it's X's and O's, you definitely have Frank Smith on this list. You definitely have probably Bobby Slowick on this. You have different names. This is a culture, mentality type of hire that they are looking for. To me, it seems like, right? And I think obviously you mentioned Ben Johnson. Everyone, like I just said, how great I think he is offensively, at least what he's doing. But the other guys on that list, they are tough sons of guns, right? They come from tough cultures that have won a lot, and they have a good approach. Like even Raheem Morris, like, again, I know LA is a little bit different than Baltimore or Michigan or one of these other teams, but God bless, man. Like that is a winner, and they get the most out of their guys there, you know? So I think that's something else to consider.
Yeah. And I think the last thing, just to kind of circle all of this together, some comments from last night in the locker room and today about, you know, the guy that is probably the toughest on the commander staff is Bieniemy. And Charles Leno and Logan Thomas said basically the same exact thing, which is like, we butted heads with the guy at times. There were some ups and downs, but he was totally uncompromising and he was the same guy every day. And I thought that was really interesting because that was a way for two guys who were vets to basically be like, yeah, I didn't love this. But I also am going to say something nice enough that I don't come off as a total jackwagon. I'm going to say something nice. I'm going to be a professional. But I do think when we talk about the culture moving forward, that is something that needs to be examined on the roster as well.
Yeah, absolutely.
Because it definitely, like, John Allen had his moments this year in terms of leadership. I mean, for whatever it's worth, like, if you don't post to talk to the media after your final game or for a locker clean out, is it the end of the world? No. But dude, if you're a team captain and you're MIA after the final game of the regular season and you don't post for a locker clean out, it's not a great look.
Right.
And then you got two of your big vets coming out saying like, yeah, I don't know that the offensive coordinator is my best friend, which is not to say that like I'm assigning blame to either the vets or the OC. But when a young guy like Jahan is coming out talking about the leaders on the team,
right,
and like we need better leadership from the players, kind of like you talking about those guys over there, those big tall guys over there,
right?
You know, and that's the kind of thing that I wonder, if you will.
And I think that's something that we'll learn more about as we get into the off season about, you know, how people really feel about that stuff. You know, here's like the first domino in terms of real information to fall.
Yeah.
People are going to start talking here before you know it. And I definitely think that's going to be an interesting conversation.
But just in terms of like when you build the culture moving forward, like you got to make sure your vets, the guys you bring in, are guys that are supportive of your head coach, that are believing in the system. And I mean, again, like you were that guy in San Francisco. Like Kyle brought you in partly because you were a good blocker and he needed someone to block defensive ends.
Definitely more to the latter part of that, where I'm here to kind of help install belief and help get the system across. And that was awesome that he did that. But that is a thing, right? And I look at, again, how San Fran is built and like what they value in certain positions and the kind of guys they get. They're not the most valuable guys league wide, like Deebo Samuel, good player, right? But he fits what they do really well.
Yeah.
He's very physical. He's tough, right? George Kittle, physical, tough, like not the most nuanced route runner, but obviously they've prioritized that kind of guy, right?
Yeah.
And it's not like they don't have fun at practice. They do. And I think Kyle has learned how to relate to those guys, but they have, from the GM to the coach, have identified a type of person that they want on that team that fits with their vision. It's the same thing with Seattle. Like, say what you want about Pete Carroll, he does a great job of finding people that fit his vision.
Team's thing is compete.
Correct.
And he finds competitive sons of guys. Like Devin Witherspoon is a freaking Seahawk, man.
Yeah. And I think, and you just go down the list of what he prioritized. And they're not always guys of the highest character or the best workers necessarily, but they say we want dudes who are going to compete and they love football. And they get those guys there. And I think that's, again, why this GM to coach is so important for establishing this identity, because they can say, how do we establish this vision? And then again, if it's going to be a very jarring transition, you know, they got to make sure they got the right guy to helm the ship too, or gal while we're here. So
yeah, for sure. And also potentially throw some people into the ocean, so to speak. They'll be fine. Like they're not actually going to like go into the middle of the ocean. But if you have people that don't really fit that mantra and you figure that out quickly, like sometimes in year one of a coaching regime, you get that surprise training camp cut of a veteran. And you know, maybe that's something that this clip looks prescient at the end of this podcast in August as we tape it in the middle, actually the beginning really still of January. Although we're way closer to the middle of January than I want to admit. Anyway, our podcast is over. Thank you so much for listening, not just today, but all season long. Obviously, it has been a tough one to talk about. And, you know, for a podcast that thrives on X's and O's, when the games become a little less relevant, it's not always the easiest show to do, but you guys kept on listening and we really appreciate it. Our draft stuff's going to be awesome. Logan's already started on that. I got my draft prep that I'm starting as well. But I know where our bread is buttered. It's with Logan's, and don't worry, he started. And other than that, we'll be with you 2 times weekly. Our schedule adjusts a little bit here over the next couple of weeks. Obviously, we're always on standby for breaking news as well. But make sure you subscribe. That way you don't miss anything on YouTube or on your favorite podcast app. For Logan, I'm Craig, and we'll see you next time on Take Command. Thanks for watching this clip of Take Command. First, why don't you like it? It lets other people know that it was good, and then they should watch it too. And Logan, we have a new exclusive home for full episodes.
We do. 1067 The Fans YouTube page. Go check it out and please subscribe.
Yeah, do what Logan said.
Do it.
Very, very smart.